Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, an honor to be serving as the Rajaratnam Professor. I followed, of course, for many years the work that this center does and its evolution as the preeminent strategic studies center here in Singapore. And so it's a real honor to be here for some time to give a few lectures. Exactly as has been mentioned, the area that I've focused on most extensively across my career has been Japan. That said, I've always been interested in the evolution of Japan in the broader world. It's, of course, the third largest economy in the world. It has played, and I think continues to play, a much more important role than most people realize in the international system. I think that consciousness of Japan's role is larger is larger in Southeast Asia than in most parts of the world. But it certainly is something that I think deserves to be highlighted. At a time like this, with a prime minister who, for the first time in more than a decade, has actually continued in office for more than a year, since Prime Minister Koizumi left office just almost 10 years ago now. There's a continuity in Japanese politics that I think is offering some opportunities for longer range thinking in Japan and in its relationships with the US and other parts of the world. It's also, of course, given the background of Prime Minister Abe as the grandson of Prime Minister Kishi, who, of course, while he worked very adamantly for the renewal of the US-Japan Security Treaty and did succeed in that in 1960. Also, of course, had been involved with pre-war industrial policy and pre-war and wartime policy making in Japan. And so, in regional terms, vis-a-vis history issues and so on, of course, there have been since he became prime minister this time and the previous time as well. You know, there's been controversiality in that regard. But what I'd like to do is to review just briefly the changes that we have seen in world affairs, particularly in the last 3 years, 2.5 years, a little more than 3 years now since Prime Minister Abe became Prime Minister, and how those have affected the evolution of Japanese policy, the distinctive role that Prime Minister Abe has played, in some ways I think quite a historic role. The first Japanese Prime Minister to have visited all of the nations of ASEAN. He has visited, well over 50 countries globally. He's been the most, I think, globally oriented in terms of his broad dialogue with the world of any Japanese prime minister. So to talk about those and then to move to some of the very interesting questions that we have before us for the year 2016, and then other issues that are impending in the period immediately after that, right up to the Tokyo Olympics of 2000, which will be held in Tokyo in the fall, around the fall of 2020. So, by way of introduction, I think the first key point that I'd like to talk about is the rapid pace of change in world affairs that Prime Minister Abe has confronted. If we go back a few years, of course, one of the largest trends, the most important trends that we have is rising global trade interdependence, particularly with the four modernizations of China, China's historic transformation after 1978, becoming a major exporter in the world and transforming domestically as well. An increase of 300 million or so, it said, in the size of the Chinese middle class, among other things, in part because of this very rapidly rising trade interdependence of the last 25 years or so. Rising financial interdependence globally after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, the floating exchange rates from February of 1973, the massive capital flows that began across the world, particularly after the revision of Japan's foreign exchange law in December of 1980. Huge capital outflows that strengthened the dollar for a good 5 years until the Plaza Accords of 1985 allowed the United States to contract a huge budgetary deficit in the Reagan years, and yet at the same expanding, particularly defense spending, very actively in that period, and of course helping to produce the historic geopolitical changes in the world, including the collapse of the Soviet Union in early 1991. So this rising pattern of interdependence globally, since globalization began to take hold in the mid-1970s, has produced two particularly conspicuous global changes, it seems to me. Certainly has fueled the rise of China and China's deepening interdependence with the world, but also a new form of interdependence between Japan and the world that contrasts rather strikingly to what one saw in previous years. Of course, in energy terms, Japan has always been vulnerable. Volatile energy prices recently have had a tremendous importance for Japan because it imports 99% of its oil, about 85% roughly of its primary energy supply, increasingly from the Persian Gulf as well. So in the last two decades, broadly, we're talking about the transformations since the 1980s. Japan has become more and more dependent on the Middle East in energy terms, even as China, of course, has also begun since 1993 to be a major importer and now imports about 4 million barrels of oil a day across many of the sea lanes, the same sea lanes stretching from the East China Sea, the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf that Japan also does. Probably in terms of setting the stage for the issues that affect the diplomacy of Prime Minister Abe today, I think it's also important to note the historic geopolitical transformations that we've had since the early 1990s, particularly. Conspicuously, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991 was certainly one of them, but since 1999 also, of course, a revival in many respects, and certainly a rather determined set of foreign policies on the part of President Putin. First in his first term for 10 years, and then during the Medvedev years as Prime Minister, and now once again as President of Russia, has been the dominant figure since 1999, so well over 15 years. China, of course, China's rise flowed, as we know, from the rising trade interdependence after the modernizations began, particularly, that also produced tremendous interdependence on the world, or dependence on the world on China's part in areas like energy and finance. But the rise of China and India certainly have been major developments that have affected the environment that Japan has to deal with in its foreign policy. Many of you heard, or some of you heard, the lecture that I gave a few days ago on the new continentalism. That is to say, the deepening and transformed relationships across the continent of Asia, which have emerged in the last 20 years or so. And I think a lot of the things, these transformations that I'm talking about here, such as the collapse of the USSR, the rise of China and India, are summarized in that. Let me show you a couple of charts. Here's one that I think is more directly relevant to China and Chinese diplomacy than it is to Japan, but indirectly it has a tremendous impact on the world, the nature of the geopolitical problems that Prime Minister Abe is facing in Japan today. Let me explain just a little bit about it. I call this, in my book, The New Continentalism, the view from Kashgar. But I think it presents something, a view of the world that we rarely have been inclined to see, but something which is really quite important in driving Chinese diplomacy, Russian diplomacy, and the world that Abe has to respond to. Take a look here at the distance from the Bohai Gulf and from Beijing right here to the Strait of Hormuz in the the Persian Gulf. Two-thirds of the distance, as you can see, between Beijing and the Gulf is inside China. So the things that China does for its own domestic reasons, it doesn't have to be some sort of a foreign policy strategy of reaching out to the Gulf or trying to influence the Middle East or teaming up with Iran or anything like that, actually can ultimately shape the policies that China, the world that China responds to. Let me add something else from the perspective of Japan. Now, here's Japan. And here, of course, is the continent of Asia. As we know, China borders on, about 14 countries around the region. And as you can see, China is geopolitically right at the center. It's so close here, Singapore down here, certain areas that are growing very rapidly inside China, such as Yunnan province right here, bordering on Southeast Asia. Kunming right here is 45 minutes from Dhaka in Bangladesh by plane, about less than an hour from Calcutta right here. It's directly adjoins Myanmar. Of course, you have the Himalayas here that limits the interaction between India and China. But both China and India are right at the heart of a Eurasia that also stretches westward. Here's Horgos, the border point between China and Kazakhstan, and then this is the Ukraine here, and Belarus. There's the border of Schengen. There's the border of the European Union, right there. So, and Chongqing is around here, and so it's fairly direct. And again, about close to half of the distance between the western border of the European Union and the eastern part of China over here is inside China. So once again, I think what is often missed in the analysis of Chinese foreign policy and the world that Japan has to respond to is the geopolitics, or the raw geography of the situation, the things that China does for its own sake, for its own domestic reasons, such as the Western policies that Xi Jinping, or that rather Jiang Zemin actually introduced in 1999, actually have much broader implications that we've seen beginning to unfold particularly in the last 2 or 3 years since Abe became prime minister. So, as you can see here, the geopolitical dilemma, in a sense, that Japan faces, that Prime Minister Abe faces in dealing with the broader world of Eurasia, is the fact that Japan is here and China is here. It's in a much more central position vis-a-vis certainly the continent of Eurasia than China is. Or rather, China is in a more central position. But that said, the potential for Japan as a balancer, the countries of Central Asia, of course, have many of their own concerns regarding China, or in some parts of Southeast Asia. For example, here's Vietnam, right here, which of course, relative to the East-South China Sea problem and so on, also has significant differences with China. So the map, I think, in some important ways, and the way that it has been transformed as a result of the end of the Cold War, influences the nature of the environment that Prime Minister Abe has to deal with. Another very important consideration, of course, is the scale of Japan's economy. With the yen depreciating, and it has moved from around 90 yen or so to the US dollar when he became prime minister to roughly 120. Recently, of course, it's strengthened in connection with the financial crisis or the financial uncertainties in China and so on. But so it's been about a 30% depreciation, which has reduced the scale of Japan in the global economy to about 6%. But still, if this is the United States at 22 and China has become much larger that way. Japan is the third largest, significantly more than Germany or Britain or some of the other major economies in the world. It has tremendous weight economically speaking. And also, I'm not sure if I have this, but it has a great deal of weight. Let me just add one additional thing. Exports don't loom nearly as importantly in aggregate GDP for Japan as they do for any of its other major neighbors, particularly for China, with exports on the close to roughly 30% of GDP. In the case of Japan, lower, around 20%, something like that. In the case of Korea, higher, around 35% or so. Japanese growth over the years has been stimulated more heavily by internal demand, very heavy capital investment, for example, than has been true in many of the other cases. And of course, Japan, with a very high savings rate, also has not had to import capital. So in the Asian financial crisis, for example, when the Korea and Southeast Asia both, of course, suffered tremendously because they were dependent on foreign capital, and the instability of exchange rates made it difficult for them to repay their debts. Japan was a rock of stability in the region. In contrast to China, it didn't have the foreign exchange controls that insulated China to a much greater degree from the volatile environment. But it didn't have to import capital. And that still is the case. Japan's public debt, of course, is now well over 200% of GDP. It's one of the highest in the world, but it's owed to the Japanese people. And so it still doesn't affect the international financial situation or the threat of financial developments in Japan don't prospectively have the kind of destabilizing effect on the international system that those in some other countries that depend more heavily on foreign capital would. There is one deep vulnerability that I think we should remember. Generally thought of as a vulnerability now with low interest, with low energy prices. Of course, this could be a advantage for Japan. Its resource vulnerability, net energy imports as a percentage of energy use, extremely high, as you can see in Japan. Singapore is even higher, but of course it's a city-state. It's not the kind of large economy, number 3 in the world, that Japan is. But this vulnerability is much greater than in the case of other major nations. The impact that I believe this does have for Prime Minister Abe's diplomacy, first of all, inevitably the Middle East, potentially Russia as an alternative, those become more important considerations for Japan than they would for most other nations in the world. Now, another consideration that I think is important in thinking about Japanese foreign policy and the way that Japan relates to the world is it's a distinctive history and a distinctive set of institutions. And of course, Japan is highly organized. Efficiency has been extremely high. But it also has had a long history of isolation. As we know, from 1638 until 1854, the coming of the black ships in 1854, except for trade through the port of Nagasaki and some other cultural relationships, Japan was largely isolated from the broader world for 2 centuries. After that, rather remarkably, of course, it transformed itself, and at the high noon of imperialism, in a period when most other nations of the industrial world, not of the emerging world, fell under colonial rule, Japan avoided that, and of course itself became an imperial power. And that long history, or that history less than a century, turbulent history, we know that history. Everyone knows that, and that's a residue that certainly affects Japan's foreign policy today. On both, I think, arguably in both, there are some positive and some negative dimensions, or at least those perceived that way in Japan. Maybe in terms of, to speak to the economic side of this that I think is not as well known, Japan didn't get tariff autonomy until 1911, full tariff autonomy in relation to controlling its own tariffs. The imperial powers forced Japan, just as they did China, for example, and much of the developing world, to keep low tariffs so that the imports of the industrial world, Britain and the United States and some of the others, could come freely in. Now, as a consequence of this, Japan developed a whole series of, and also for other reasons to promote its own industrial development, of subnational institutions, industry associations, complicated distribution system, corporations that engaged in specialized companies to engage in trading and so on. That did have the function to some extent of informally channeling and regulating the trade flows in Japan. And many of these also were strengthened in the mobilization of the 1930s for World War II, industry associations and so on. The result of this, I think, it's broad, specialists do realize it, but I think it's not as generally appreciated. Japan has, in the post-war period, had generally very low tariff rates, and in some areas a degree of free trade with the world that really was not appreciated. But at the same time, it's also had indirect barriers of various kinds, or trading practices and trading institutions that have channeled trade. In some cases they've facilitated trade, and in some cases they've inhibited trade with the world. And agriculture, of course, the agricultural cooperatives have been one important aspect of that, but not the only one. And all of those things are changing, but the informal or the subnational side of the Japanese economy, I think, is also something to remember. Japan, in summary, probably what I would want to say, is a country of massive scale, much larger scale than we often appreciate, economically speaking, that has been driven more by domestic capital investment, much of it through overloans and highly leveraged investment relating to land, using land as collateral, rather than a very, very high level of reliance on exports, compared, for example, to Korea or China, or even many countries of Southeast Asia. So, not surprisingly, and then financially, it's also been autonomous. It hasn't had to rely on foreign capital to nearly the degree that either Southeast Asia or Korea or even China have done. So as a result of this, its economy is not, while it's deeply engaged with the world, and of course centers like Tokyo have become key financial centers for the world as a whole, the Japanese economy in a trading sense has, and also in a socio-political sense, because of the historical heritage, also the fact that there are the immigrant communities. Japan is quite a homogeneous nation. It has, of course, only a very small immigrant population. The largest, over 1 million people of Chinese background, and then, well, in a good-sized Korean community, roughly the same, but a very homogeneous, relatively speaking. It doesn't, and following, it doesn't have the very large immigrant communities or the plural population, certainly not of Singapore or the United States or even China or India or Russia. It's a much more homogeneous country, and it's autonomous financially, and its trade trade flows as a percentage of GNP are relatively low. So there's a certain detachment, historically, I think it's fair to say, from the world. And I'm talking about the period, right across Japan's modern history, or since World War II. That said, the relationship with the United States, in particular, has been quite close, and you know, over in the late 80s, as late as 1990, 40% of Japan's exports went to the U.S. That ratio has gone down below 20%. Japan sends more exports and also gets more imports from Asia. Now, it does by a significant margin than it does from the United States. But that relationship historically since the over the post-war years with the U.S. has been relatively large, but then the shift has been in the last 2 decades, particularly toward Asia. And I think it's probably fair to say as well, going back to what I said about continentalism, that partly given this kind of a geography, with Japan as an island nation, the maritime ties, we don't have the map of the world here, but you know, the United States is over here, Europe is all the way across the world. That relationship, I think, is significantly more distant, it seems to me, and in the last 5 years or so, particularly as continentalism emerges more strongly, this kind of links across the continent have been evolving more rapidly probably than the relationships between Japan and Europe. That said, now this is just by way of prelude, because it seems to me Prime Minister Abe has had to respond to this broad sort of global situation that I'm laying out of a continentalism where, you know, Eurasia is becoming somewhat closer, China is growing rapidly, China and India, and Japan is off the coast here, and it has to think about, you know, who does it deal with, how does it tie up diplomatically, what sort of a global role does it want to play as an island nation, in some ways analogous to the position of Britain off the continent of Europe, you know, that has a lot of options, but also has a tendency toward some degree of isolation, because it's not pressed by the developments on the continent to the degree that many of the other countries might be. That's a particular view, and I do look forward to some discussion. Some people, I think, might have a different view, but at least that's what I have begun to feel. But again, it's a country of immense potential, immense organizational skills, of great efficiency, high levels of capital formation, and a desire to be international and a desire to play a key role in the world, and one that has made some very important contributions out of a heritage that has been somewhat parochial. Organization, as I say, I should really stress this. The Japanese industrial groups, the Keiretsu, for example, the ones that you know best are, you know, the Mitsubishis of the world. Mitsubishi Corporation, I know, is very active in Singapore and many of the nations of Southeast Asia. You know, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Itochu, the large trading companies of Japan. They do exports, they do imports, they do capital investment. They're multifaceted firms that have been very important in the and do continue to be important in the evolution of the economy of the region. And then within Japan, you know, the organization, I think, is one of the strongest characteristics of Japan. Demographic change. I should say just a word about this. Japan has been aging more rapidly than, well, first of all, I should say, Europe has also, several countries of Europe have been aging quite rapidly as well. Italy, for example. But Japan, its population, high point I think was 2005. The Japanese population last year declined about 230,000 or so. Although the number of births in Japan, for the first time in about 5 years, grew. The number of children who were born was greater in Japan than it had been. But you can see what the implication is here. This kind of a shifting pyramid, people in their 40s, in their 60s, becoming a larger and larger share. And of course, now in Japan, for example, today there are about 55,000 people over 100 years old. Now that, I remember when I was with U.S. Embassy Tokyo, there were about 13,000. And that's, what, 14 years ago. So, you know, I mean, that's an extreme figure. To achieve the age of 100 is quite an achievement, but there's, you know, 55,000 people in Japan. I think it's the highest by a significant margin in the world. But this can create, as you can see over time, a significant economic problem. Although, of course, there's also industries that emerge, pharmaceuticals, for example. It's an area that Japan has been growing stronger in, medical technology, medical equipment, in part because of this. But it raises new issues that Prime Minister Abe also has to confront. For example, the whole question of immigration. There's a considerable debate in Japan just recently, for example, about Singapore. I know the debate is rising again in Singapore as well about immigration policy and what should be done in that regard. This is a significant issue as Japan's age structure rises, which needs to be thought about. Another aspect of this that sometimes we forget, there's a lot of talk about the revival of the Japanese militarism and this sort of thing in many quarters. But I think one also has to recognize that with an aging population and with greater and greater prospective welfare costs, that these become a counter pressure against the expansion of defense spending and so on. And perhaps we could use the same logic also another 15 years down the road in thinking about China. China, of course, has maybe 10 to 15 years behind Japan in terms of this sort of a demographic evolution. But with the one-child policy, China has also an age structure that will begin in the 2020s, will begin to age significantly and will have much larger welfare costs, which could very well, just as I think they are also beginning to in Japan, become a counter pressure against rapid increases in military spending. Now, let me say just a few words about Prime Minister Abe's diplomacy itself. After laying the groundwork in terms of what I've said, I think Japan faces a lot of challenges. The economy having been relatively stagnant, the vulnerability of Japan in terms of energy resources, the demographic challenges that become an undertow preventing or making an ambitious sort of global diplomacy, including the political military side, making it more difficult. Now, that said, Prime Minister Abe has visited more countries in his 3 years plus in office than any Japanese prime minister, I believe, including he's visited every country of ASEAN. He's made 2 major visits to the United States and had, 4 summit conferences, I think, with President Obama. He actually had in his first 14 months of office 5 meetings with President Putin of Russia. And I'll come back to that issue also. There were some rather major initiatives, Japanese initiatives to Russia, that actually have, of course, slowed down. Since the Ukraine crisis arose, Prime Minister Abe visited Kiev with the support of the the EU and the United States. And the Russians retaliated by sending Prime Minister Medvedev to the northern territories that Japan also claims, and essentially ending the possibility of a visit by President Putin to, or at least delaying the prospects of President Putin's visit to Tokyo, and perhaps, I think likely also, the likelihood that Russia would participate in the forthcoming Ise-Jima summit, G7 summit in Japan, this scheduled for this coming July. So Abe has pursued a really global diplomacy. Broadly speaking, I think in the early stages it had some nationalist flashes. The visit to Yasukuni Shrine in December of 2013, about a year after Prime Minister Abe came to office. But after that, in April of 2014, there was quite a successful summit in Tokyo, President Obama's visit. And since then, U.S.-Japan relations, and I've seen a lot of this directly, and a former student is the director in the National Security Council for U.S.-Japan affairs. And I think that U.S.-Japan relations have greatly strengthened, and particularly in connection with the summit last April when Prime Minister Abe visited Washington. He spoke to a joint meeting of Congress. There was a new agreement on the U.S.-Japan defense guidelines. And then after that, collective self-defense was ratified by the Japanese Diet. And then the TPP agreement was also concluded. So there's been a series of things that have significantly strengthened U.S.-Japan relations just in the last the last year. So Abe's global diplomacy shifted increasingly, I think, toward a U.S.-Japan axis over the course of the last 3.5 years, and conversely, I think the United States view of Abe's diplomacy and what Abe is doing has also improved quite significantly. And the changes in China's relations with Europe and so on have probably also strengthened that same tendency toward a stronger U.S.-Japan relationship. Domestically, of course, Abe, the major development is that you all know about, called Three Arrows, the monetary being the first, the expansion of the money supply. It's had the effect of depreciating the yen, although the objective, nominally at least, was domestic. Then fiscal budget spending. Japan enacted a 3% increase in the value-added tax, the consumption tax, but it also, in the short run, massively expanded the government fiscal spending to try to get the economy started again. And then the third one, the structural changes. That's where the verdict is still out, probably to put it mildly. Many people would say that one really hasn't succeeded. There are some aspects. I guess my own personal view is that we shouldn't ignore some dimensions that are really not often talked about, that are more indirect but still are substantive. For example, the so-called Nikkei 400, the designation of a benchmark of 400 firms who pursue very positive corporate governance as the objects of investment by government pension funds and other government entities. So it's inflating the stock prices of companies that pursue positive corporate governance, that have outside directors, that have market-oriented policies, and that sort of mechanisms through the stock market actually are putting pressures for economic reform. In agriculture, under TPP, in relation to TPP, but actually separately, an agreement that Prime Minister or Minister Hayashi, the agriculture minister, achieved about 6 months ago that prepared the way for Japan's concessions in relation to TPP. The agricultural cooperatives lost their monopoly control over distribution of fertilizer and and rice and agricultural products of various kinds. They kept the right to do financial business, to do insurance. You know, they actually even have travel agencies and things like that. And that kind of stuff is very lucrative business that they are, you know, they're continuing to make a lot of money out of. And so they still are in good financial shape, but they don't have the monopoly power to control agricultural commodities and imports and so on the way that they used to. So there's some quite significant changes in terms of Japanese agricultural policy that Prime Minister Abe has introduced as part of the third arrow, and I think those probably haven't gotten the recognition they deserve. Security policy. In this area, of course, the big development is collective self-defense. That is to say, the right, shudan tekijieken in Japanese, or the right, under constitutionally, or under, I guess, the United Nations Charter and so on, those rights exist. The traditional interpretation of the Constitution has been that the Japanese government did not exercise the right of collective self-defense. But that is to say, the right to aid allies or third parties if third parties came under attack, and even when the Japanese forces did not. Constitutionally, Japan was constrained to against any actions that were not directly defensive in nature, but so that if, under the traditional interpretation before this last July, if an ally or a United Nations entity, some third party that Japan was associated with came under attack, the Japanese forces did not have the right to respond to that. Now, that provision was revised by legislation that was passed by the Japanese Diet this last summer. I know it is controversial in some parts of Asia, although in the United States, I worked for 3 of our ambassadors. All of the ambassadors that I worked for, they didn't speak out on the issue because it was a Japanese domestic issue, but they did support that notion as being really quite important in the alliance relationships between Japan and the United States. If, for example, U.S. forces were attacked and Japanese forces couldn't respond, that would be a major constraint. And then there are some areas, like, for example, the minesweeping, where Japan has one of the strongest minesweeping forces in the world. It's the ability to take mines. It's a defensive capability, but it's quite an important one for maritime operations. And Japan's ability to assist a broader fleet, United Nations or an allied fleet of some sort, in minesweeping operations was constrained under the traditional interpretation. That constraint has been taken away. And so in some contexts, of course, that could be strategically important, particularly in cooperative activities and in maritime security. For example, in the Straits, if there were some issue in the Strait of Malacca, in the Strait of Hormuz, something like that, it could be a provision that would be significant. There may be more interest in this, and I'm more than happy to discuss it, but I do think that the general view of the collective self-defense provisions, the changes that Abe has made, generally in the United States, certainly by policymakers, have been considered to be positive. And broadly, I think many defense specialists in allied nations also have considered them to be positive, although they've been considerably more controversial domestically inside Japan, partly because some people fear that they might involve Japan in land-based. I think the emphasis has been particularly a fear that in the Middle East or in some sort of contingency against terrorism or some sort of a land-based contingency, that collective self-defense might draw Japan into conflicts that it didn't want to be involved in. I don't think strategically that has generally been the intention of allies of Japan, but of course it's an open-ended question and probably depends on the contingency. Let me just try to conclude as quickly as I can. Just a few things I wanted to point out to you that I think are quite important on the security side of things. Again, coming back to geography, I think we all tend to think Japan's up there somewhere in Northeast Asia, and it's a long ways away. But we forget how close Japan. I wish that I could draw, down here, maybe Singapore might be down here somewhere. But Japan extends quite a long ways to the south. You can see here's particularly what I found interesting is to realize the strategic location of Okinawa itself. This is Naha, Okinawa, where there's a major U.S. Air Force base, Kadena Air Force Base here on the island of Okinawa. But also further to the south, there are islands here, the so-called Senkakus, or Diaoyutai Islands, that are disputed between China and Japan, are right here. And you can see how close this is to Shanghai. Naha is twice as close to Shanghai as it is to Tokyo. Okinawa, where these islands down here are even closer. Look how close the Ishigakijima or Miyakojima, or Yonaguni, right at the end of the island chain of Okinawa are to Taiwan. And then look also here at how close Okinawa is to the Philippines. Japan actually extends, and because of Okinawa, here's Kyushu here. So Kyushu is roughly halfway between Tokyo and Taiwan. whereas these places are, you know, they're right down there next to Taiwan, or actually down there next to the Philippines. So Japan, and then some others like Okino Torishima and Iwajima Chichigima, some of these islands, there are also some small islands out here to the south of Japan that extend very deeply into the Pacific. In Guam, there's a large U.S. military base in Guam that probably is the most important location strategically in the Pacific for the United States, which is here. And so there are some Japanese islands down here, and then the Okinawa is here, and Guam is out here. So the geographic configuration of Japan, which I think sometimes isn't appreciated, actually has quite a bit of importance to the security not only of Japan, but certainly but also of these areas further to the south, certainly to the Philippines, and this is the South China Sea right here. This is, of course, Vietnam. Singapore is about down there. And these are, the other point I think I should definitely make, you remember I said earlier that Japan gets almost all, about 85% of its oil from the Middle East. Well, the oil that Japan gets flows generally right through, of course, the super tankers, you've seen them, they come right by here, by Singapore. But they come down through this area here, through the South China Sea. So it is true that certainly Japan is not a neighbor. It's not one of the literal nations along the South China Sea. And, you know, China certainly is closer to the South China Sea than Japan is. But that said, Japan gets 85% of its oil or through the South China Sea. And of course Korea is right here. Korea is in the same situation. Korea also gets the overwhelming share of its oil through the same sea lanes that pass through the South China Sea and Singapore and then off to the Persian Gulf. Now, yeah, here, you can see this more clearly down this way, across here into the Gulf, through these straits. And as I was saying earlier, the new collective self-defense provisions under the Japanese legislation have quite a bit of importance for the potential role that Japan could play with regard to these areas that actually are quite important to Japanese energy security, since they get 85% of their oil from here, from the Gulf. Now, let me just, in conclusion, say a word or two about history. And maybe I should just flag the issue, because I dare say there probably will be questions about that. Well, I think maybe I've already said what I would be relevant to say. The history issues. There was a recent agreement between Japan and Korea proposing major compensation for the comfort women, and that was accepted by the Korean government, and direct compensation, and also a direct apology by Prime Minister Abe. I myself argued, earlier that there were, that the August 15th declarations and so on did not amount to a direct apology, although they were a repetition of the fact that many Japanese prime ministers in the past had apologized in connection with historical issues. But very clearly in this latest case, Prime Minister Abe did personally give an apology, and also for the first time Japan offered direct compensation. In 1995 it offered through a privately funded Asian Women's Fund, provided compensation for the company, and this time it was direct. And so whether that is sufficient or not, of course, is in a matter of some private debate, some vigorous private debate. The Korean government itself, however, did accept the arrangement that Japan had proposed. And so very recently on the history issue, just a couple of weeks ago, there's some recent developments there. Coming up, there's some historical issues, some major questions. Let me just flag them because I do want to get people's reactions and comments. In April of this year, TPP is scheduled for ratification in the Diet. Next May, the 26th and 27th of May of 2016, there's going to be a G7 summit held at Isejima in Japan. And it looks like G7. As I say, there was some talk, and I think it's fair that Japan tentatively did want to see if a G8 summit couldn't be arranged to also involve Russia. But Prime Minister Abe visited Kiev in solidarity with Europe and the United States on the Ukraine problem, and it looks as though that prospect is becoming more distant. I think there's a very good chance that Japan will have a double election, both the House of Councilors and House of Representatives in July. There certainly will be a House of Councilors election. That's scheduled. Whether the House of Representatives will also be dissolved, that's at the discretion of Prime Minister Abe. His term lasts until December. It's a 4-year term. The last election was in December of 2012. So he's coming close. He has another 6 months, but historically the LDP, his ruling party, has done better if they hold both elections at the same time. And so I think there's a very good chance that may happen this time. And will he get another mandate? He got a resounding mandate last time. As I was saying, I think the collective self-defense certainly is a bit controversial. And that, and then the problems of the third arrow of the Japanese economy getting restarted, may undermine his possibility of, another large-scale majority. I think the prospect is probably that the LDP would get another majority, although probably significantly reduced from what it was. Although, of course, that's up in the air right now. It's hard to know. And then going to the future, of course, is this whole issue of the Tokyo Olympics that I think is also stimulating some changes on the economic side, such as the special economic zone in Tokyo, where a lot of the traditional controls on land use and over-regulation and so on are being relaxed. So I think to put all this together, Prime Minister Abe has been quite ambitious. He is operating in a world that is geopolitically more difficult for Japan. And of course in a world where some memories of history and so on also remain. There's probably a learning curve. I think he's been relatively pragmatic. Early in his term particularly, he was more assertive on some of the historical issues and so on than later. If one looks, for example, at the evolution from the Yasukuni visit in December of 2013 to a direct apology in connection with the comfort women issue just about a month ago. It seems to me there is a significant evolution in Abe's approach. So the verdict is out, and I look forward to your comments and questions.